Welcome to this explainer. Okay, if you're watching this, there is a very high chance you've already had a cup of coffee today. It's just this totally mundane part of our morning routine, right? A quick way to shake off the sleep before running out the door. But what if I told you that this simple, everyday beverage has a secret, incredibly dramatic backstory? The history of coffee isn't just some boring tale about farming. It's this massive saga of shifting powers, social uprisings, and huge economic transformations.
Okay, let's dive into this. What is the dangerous global history hiding inside your morning mug? You know, we tend to think of coffee as this cozy comfort drink, but historically, the coffee bean was a powerful catalyst. It quite literally built global empires, sparked social revolutions, and fueled the rise of the modern world. Today, we're going to trace the journey of this remarkable little bean, from its wild origins all the way to its absolute global dominance.
So the story starts way earlier than you might think. Before it was this massive global commodity, coffee was originally just gathered from bushes growing completely wild in Ethiopia, over in Northeast Africa. By the early 1500s, traders started buying it, and its use as a drink slowly spread throughout the Arab world and the Middle East. And this is fascinating. By 1522, in the Turkish city of Constantinople, which was the absolute heart of the Ottoman Empire, coffee wasn't just some casual beverage. The court physician actually approved it to be used as a medicine. No way, right? And by the mid-1500s, all this demand meant coffee bushes were being officially cultivated in Yemen.
Now, the really crucial thing to understand here is that this early cultivation wasn't widespread at all. For the next 100 years, Yemen basically held a total monopoly. They produced almost all of the coffee drunk across Africa and the Arab world. Think about that for a second. This tiny geographic region tightly controlled the entire early global supply, which obviously made it an incredibly valuable and highly sought-after commodity across the Eastern Hemisphere.
Moving on to Section 1, the original social networks.
This brings us to a really fascinating shift in our story, where we see how coffee completely transformed the way human beings actually interact with each other. What's so interesting about coffee is its immediate effect on social life. It was a profoundly public drink. Unlike today, where you just brew a pot in your kitchen while still in your pajamas, back then, coffee was rarely drunk at home. Instead, people actually left their houses and went to dedicated coffee houses to drink it. Now, these were predominantly male-dominated spaces where people would gather, grab a cup, and most importantly, chat about the pressing issues of the day. It was literally the birth of a brand new kind of public forum.
But, as you can probably guess, this new public forum completely terrified the authorities. In 1623, the ruler of Constantinople viewed these spaces as so politically dangerous that he literally demanded the absolute destruction of all coffee houses in the city. I mean, the sheer ability for common citizens to just gather outside their homes and share opinions, that was seen as a massive direct threat to the establishment. But of course, you can't suppress a good idea, or a good cup of coffee, for long. After his death, many new coffee houses opened right back up, and consumption just kept on growing.
As coffee moved west, the culture evolved right along with it. In the 17th century, coffee drinking finally spread to Europe. These coffee shops became spaces where ordinary people, again, pretty much always men at the time, could just meet up to exchange ideas. The intellectual environment was so rich that some people actually argued these everyday coffee houses performed a similar function to full-blown universities. It's wild to think about, but the impact on social life was enormous. In fact, many major social movements and political developments of that era found their absolute origins right there in the middle of a coffeehouse discussion.
Section 2. Colonization and Coffee Empires.
Now, this is where the story shifts gears, moving from local social hubs to a massive global industry that completely reshaped the world. By the late 1600s, that century-old Yemeni monopoly on coffee production we talked about earlier, it finally broke down. And why? Well, because European colonization stepped in. As European powers expanded their reach across the globe, they quickly realized the immense financial potential of this crop. So what did they do? They set up their own massive coffee plantations in places like Indonesia and the Caribbean. Thanks to this colonial expansion, global coffee production absolutely skyrocketed practically overnight.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how that specific colonial history still lives on in our vocabulary today. I bet you've ordered a mocha or a java without thinking twice about it, right? Well, as production spread, different types of coffee were produced in different colonial areas. The names given to these distinct types, mocha and java, were actually taken directly from the specific geographic ports they were shipped out of on their way to Europe. So those everyday terms you use at the drive-thru are literally direct echoes of 18th century shipping routes.
But we definitely have to acknowledge the grim reality of exactly how this massive European production was achieved.
The labor systems varied a lot between colonies, but they were deeply, deeply tied to exploitation. Over in Brazil and the Caribbean colonies, coffee was grown on huge plantations where the workers were almost entirely enslaved people. On the other hand, in places like Java, which was colonized by the Dutch, a different system was used. There, peasants grew the coffee but were forced to hand over a massive chunk of it directly to the Dutch just to pay their taxes. So regardless of the specific method, 18th century coffee production was completely and inextricably linked to the mechanisms of colonization.
The sheer scale of this was just massive. To satisfy the absolutely booming demand back in Europe, coffee was grown in ever-increasing quantities. It quickly became nearly as important to those colonial powers as the massive sugar industry, which, by the way, was operating under very similar exploitative conditions. Yet even with this massive surge in supply, the price of coffee still stayed surprisingly high. It just wasn't cheap enough for regular people to brew at home every day. So for the time being, it remained kind of a luxury item, with most people still drinking it in those public coffee houses.
Moving along to Section 3, the Great Tea Divide.
Let's take a quick detour here to look at a major cultural split that happened around this time, because it's a split we can still clearly see today. While coffee was absolutely booming across mainland Europe, Britain was introduced to a brand new drink from China, tea. It started to become incredibly popular and gradually began eating up coffee's market share in Britain. At first, tea was so ridiculously expensive that only the very top upper classes could afford it. But as trade routes expanded throughout the 1700s, tea eventually became the go-to drink for the entire British population.
And this is exactly where geopolitics directly influences our morning habits. When the USA gained its independence from Britain in 1776, Americans heavily identified tea with British rule and, of course, taxation. Because of that highly charged political association, Americans made a deliberate cultural shift. They permanently chose coffee as their preferred beverage, basically as a way to distance themselves from Britain. And that deeply rooted historical preference, it remains completely true in the USA to this very day.
Section 4. Fueling the working class. Let's see how this builds, because this is where coffee shifts gears and really accelerates the modern world. By the 19th century, production was already booming, but a sequence of technological advancements changed everything. First, new types of transportation were developed that were way cheaper and much more efficient. Second, because it was suddenly cheaper to move the product globally, coffee prices dramatically started to fall. Which leads us to the third major shift: ultimate affordability. For the first time in history, ordinary working people could actually afford to buy coffee and drink it at home. It completely shed its status as just a middle-class luxury item.
And honestly, the timing of this newfound affordability couldn't have been more critical. This huge drop in price happened right as large parts of Europe were plunging headfirst into the Industrial Revolution. The very nature of work was changing. People were moving into factories, and crucially, their work didn't just stop when the sun went down. These factories ran around the clock. Suddenly, coffee wasn't just a pleasant little drink for breakfast, it became a vital mass-market stimulant. It was absolutely crucial for keeping workers awake and functioning during those grueling factory night shifts. Coffee literally fueled the machinery of the Industrial Revolution.
So as we wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with a question. Next time you take a sip, what history are you actually drinking? I mean, what started as a wild bush in Ethiopia became a recognized medicine, the center of controversial public social networks, a massive driver of colonial empires, a symbol of American independence, and the very fuel that powered the working class through the Industrial Revolution. It's a truly remarkable story, hiding right there in plain sight in your morning mug. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.